This is Chiang Kai-shek on the cover of an edition of the U.S. magazine Time. Between 1927 and 1945, Chiang appeared on the cover of Time no less than 7 times. The person who orchestrated Chiang's front page appearances was the founder of Time magazine, Henry Luce.
Luce呢，这个人呢，他是出生在中国的山东，他的父亲呢是一个传教士，那么他在山东长到14岁呢，才到美国去，后来上了很有名的耶鲁大学。
1923年的时候，美国人亨利·鲁斯和他在耶鲁大学的校友哈登2个人创办了就我们现在非常熟悉的《时代周刊》Times。他们创刊的宗旨就是要把新闻传播出去。
Because of Henry Luce, the viewpoint of the U.S. media was greatly influenced by his perspectives and values, and he had strong opinions with regard to China. In the early days of the War of Resistance against Japanese aggression, Luce lobbied the U.S. administration to enter the war. It was his view that the U.S. needed to help China develop and be able to shoulder its responsibilities in international affairs and the upholding of justice.
鲁斯很同情中国，也很支持中国，他很支持蒋介石的国民政府，所以在《时代周刊》上，蒋介石出现的次数非常多。
他是一个传教士的孩子，他从某一个方面来说，他代表着一种美国人的意识形态。他们觉得人的一个可能性，通过这个传教，通过说教，通过个人的努力，能够创造一定年的这个美国。他支持蒋介石，因为蒋介石宋美龄是教徒。
Luce eulogized Chiang while voicing his disapproval of Mao Zedong, the head of the Communist Party and Chiang's opponent. An article clearly showed how he used his publications to support Chiang. Time magazine's bias was particularly evident in its news reporting on prominent figures. Time went to great lengths to present Chiang as a strong figure while describing Mao Zedong as a stooge of international communism. Under Henry Luce, Time hardly ever made mention of the political influence of the Communist Party. Becoming aware of the importance of publicity. As early as 1936, Soon Ching-ling, the wife of Sun Yat-sen, received a letter from Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai asking her to find a foreign journalist who would come and report on the communist-controlled area in Shanxi. Soon Ching-ling eventually settled on Edgar Snow, an American who'd been living in China for 7 years. Snow, who'd worked for several newspapers, leaned to the left, and while teaching students in Beijing, he developed a genuine interest in the Communist Party of China.
埃德加·斯诺啊，1928年就曾经来过中国。他来过中国以后，前后他就在中国生活了13年。并且在中国结的婚。1936年呢，是他第一次到延安采访。斯诺是第一个被允许进入延安的西方新闻记者。
In the summer of 1936, as Snow made his way to Yan'an, he started work on the book that would become famous as Red Star Over China. He also took a photo of Mao Zedong. After the picture was published by the U.S. newspaper Millard's Review in November 1936, it went on to become well known across the world.
36年，斯诺进入了保安。有一天在窑洞门口啊，看到了这个毛泽东是精神很好，斯诺就是想为毛泽东拍一张好的照片。但是呢，毛泽东当时没有戴帽子，这是身边啊这个马海德。就灵机一动，把斯诺头上戴的一顶帽子就戴到了毛泽东的头上，啊，这个斯诺就瞬间给毛泽东照了这样一张照片。
In the spring of 1937, Helen Snow, the wife of Edgar Snow, made her way to Yan'an. When she finally met Mao Zedong, she took out the now classic photo taken by her husband and remarked upon it. Helen Snow said when she escaped by leaping out of a window in Xi'an, she only had two things with her: the photo taken by her husband, which could also serve as a recommendation letter, and her lipstick, a vital accessory for any young woman. In Yan'an, Helen Snow met generals of the Chinese Red Army whom she'd long admired. These are pictures of her in Yan'an. The Snows were the first foreign journalists to become acquainted with the Chinese Red Army. Years later, the hat worn by Mao in this famous picture would be designated an historical relic. "1937 saw the beginning of the War of Resistance against Japanese aggression, followed by a period of cooperation between the Kuomintang and the Communist Party of China. After Edgar Snow, the Kuomintang seldom allowed foreign journalists to visit Yan'an. The American journalist Harrison Foreman commented on this situation. "Over the past 5 years, the Kuomintang authorities have forbidden any journalist to visit Yan'an. We submitted several applications requesting permission to visit the area controlled by the Communist Party, but all our applications were indirectly refused. Our journalists receive such replies as, 'It's not convenient, the matter's uncertain.'" In the summer of 1944, however, this restriction was broken by a team of journalists. After the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the U.S. entered the war against Japan. The U.S. began to send war materials to all parties fighting against the Japanese, including those of the Chinese Communist Party.
那个时候的八路军呢，已经是正规军，主力部队八路军已经有40多万。披露他们的报道，包括他的夫人，包括白求恩在中国一边做医生一边发点新闻报道。 发点照片回去，那么使得全世界呢对中共的抗战非常就有了解，但是主要是了解这支共产党军队。世界上有一支除了苏联以外，还有这么一支共产党军队。
In July 1944, the U.S. sent a team of observers to Yan'an. At the same time, another team of journalists from China and abroad were also permitted to visit Yan'an. This is a group photo of 6 of the foreign journalists in the team with Mao Zedong. Of the 6 foreign journalists, American journalist Harrison Foreman had a much earlier connection with the Chinese Communist Party. Foreman came to Yan'an in 1936. He took his group of photos of Chinese Red Army troops around that time. The uniforms seemed quite different from the image many people have in their minds. China's Communist Army was able to deploy artillery, cavalry, and bicycle units. In the summer of 1944, Foreman entered the revolutionary base again. By that time, the Chinese Red Army had been renamed the 8th Route Army. Foreman visited Yan'an and conducted interviews in the resistance base in northern China. While there, he wrote Report from Red China and shot a huge number of pictures. These pictures covered the whole spectrum of border life. Foreman had graduated from the University of Wisconsin, majoring in Oriental languages. During
因为那个时候社会不缺那种豪华，不缺少那种风度翩翩，不缺少我们现在追求那种东西，缺的是就是说你能够一西装革履，但你还是能够跟老百姓一样，缺的是那个东西。
Zhou Enlai always has a courteous smile in Foreman's pictures. Foreman took pictures of other generals such as Zhu De, Peng Dehuai, Lin Biao, and Chen Yi. In July 1944, Foreman and these Chinese generals in Yan'an received the group of observers dispatched by the U.S. Army.
中国抗战结束以前，蒋介石有很多次就是威胁美国，实际上是假的，我要投降了，暗示他。 迫使美国人加强进攻，那么美国人考察中国，又要把共产党的军队作为一个很重要的元素来研究的话，实际上呢，这是美国人在跟蒋介石斗智斗勇。
In this picture taken by Foreman, Colonel Barrett and his colleagues received a warm welcome from the leaders of the Chinese shows young people in the border region learning dance, a pastime that was popular in Yan'an at the time. Foreman described this in his report from Red China. On any evening, you might see bushy-haired, shirt-sleeved Mao Zedong having a grand time dancing a fast one-step with a cute co-ed from Yan'an, while a truck driver might be swinging buxom Madame Chu Te. Roly-poly Chu Te himself, commander-in-chief of over 500,000 Jap killers, was having the time of his life dancing with a bright young thing 1/2 his size and 1/3 his age. After their visit to Yan'an, Foreman and a number of other foreign journalists went to the front line in northern China, from where they were able to get a feel for the fighting, as the Japanese were losing ground at the time and subjected to frequent attacks from both the army and civilians. These photos taken by foremen are of 8th Route Army soldiers holding captured Japanese supplies. This one shows a Japanese prisoner of war. This poster boasts of the welcoming treatment given to Japanese prisoners at the Workers' and Peasants' School in Yan'an. On the front line in northern China, Foreman focused his camera on the determined local militias who also fought against the Japanese. The Junior Pioneers on Parade, a local militia unit armed with homemade cannons and a grenade being placed to booby-trap a doorway. Foreman described in his report from Red China. Moreover, over 2 million people's militia were organized to harass the Japanese and to cooperate with the Paluchun regulars and guerrilla forces in their hit-and-run operations. Foreman published his report from Red China when he returned to his homeland. At around the same time, the U.S. Army Observation Group sent its report back to the U.S., and it included positive comments on the Communist Party. Carol J. Carter gave an account of the Chinese Communist Party in his book, Mission to Yan'an, American Liaison with the Chinese Communist Party. In July 1945, General Ye gave a farewell luncheon for several of the men who were leaving the mission. After a few drinks of White Lightning, Ye began criticizing the mission against Japanese fascism while continuing to support Chinese fascism. The reference to Chinese fascism was, of course, a reference to Chiang Kai-shek. After Japan surrendered in August 1945, peace did not last long between the Communist Party and the Kuomintang.
美国人把这个二战结束以后的那些物资全部给中国，包括武器，全部给中国。日本人的武器，他的武器。那么至于送给中国，中国你是共产党拿还是国民党拿，这跟美国人没关系的。美国是给你中国政府的，美国呢他也提出要国民党分点给你们共产党，但这句话不上台面的。 因为这是内政问题了，美国人不好干涉的。
After China came out of the Japanese war, the American media was divided as to the direction in which China was heading. Henry Luce issued a directive that would ensure his magazine published a portrait of Chiang Kai-shek on its cover. Theodore Harold White, a China correspondent, held very different opinions. If Time showed unconditional support for Chiang Kai-shek, we'd be failing to fulfill our duty to millions of American readers. U.S. Representative Michael J. Mansfield wrote to President Truman. General Chiang Kai-shek doesn't trust the Communist Party and thinks it'll seek to replace the Kuomintang if left unchecked. Neither the U.S. nor the Soviet Union wanted to see China launch a civil war. During the Chongqing negotiations, Patrick Hurley, the then U.S. ambassador to China, acted as a go-between for the Kuomintang and the Communist Party. He went to Yan'an to meet Mao Zedong in person and then accompanied him from Yan'an to Chongqing.
在这个过程当中，也恰恰是蒋介石最失去民心的时候转折点，因为美国人来调和了，就美国人都出面来帮我们来谈，叫你们别打了，是吧？最后打起来了，那主要责任肯定是在你政府了。
These photos of Hurley, Mao Zedong, and Chiang Kai-shek were taken by Jack Wilkes, a journalist with the U.S. magazine Life. On the surface, the figures in this picture seem relaxed, but in reality, the photos record the final separation of the two parties. These pictures taken by Foreman document a military mediation meeting between representatives from the U.S., the Kuomintang, and the Communist Party. The Communist Party representative is Ye Jianying. The Kuomintang representative is a general surnamed Tsai. The man in the middle is the American. In another picture, Ye is shaking hands with the U.S. representative, while General Tsai seems disheartened. These pictures record General Marshall's attempts to mediate in the conflict between the two parties in China at the time. Another American journalist recorded the dramatic moments when the American mediators withdrew from China. In northern Shanxi, the last American soldiers were withdrawing from Yan'an. Shortly afterwards, Hu Zongnan's army under the Kuomintang began bombarding Yan'an. In 1949, French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson came to China and recorded a decisive moment during a time of regime change. 10 years later, he visited China again. French photographer Marc Raboud visited China more than 20 times. Why was he so fascinated by China? Please join us for part 9 of Zoetrope, China in the Eyes of Foreign Photographers.